Intro. The 1960s was a decade that had a lot of Cold War tensions in places like Europe, in Vietnam, and many more places, many different countries. But it was also the decade that slowly killed the American optimism that had been so high during the previous decades. This was because of many things that happened throughout the decade, but they all added up to the overall decline of the American hope, which has been the main thing that kept the country at the top for so long and kept the people in a state of knowing what to expect and having expectations from their government. There's a lot that grew in the 60s, but also a lot that had been going back and forth and affected people more on the inside than the outside overall. But we should talk about the continuing Cold War and how it entered its second decade first. The Cold War had been going strong still, but there's always places to spread communism to. Considering communism was mainly in Asia, that was where America was most worried about communism spreading to, because there was big countries there like China and the USSR. There was Korea in the 50s, and now there could be another. That other one being Vietnam. You'll never guess what happens at the start of it. They split into two sides, the North and the South, which are both controlled by communism and then American-based values, respectively. The classic setup for a proxy war, a Cold War proxy war. It's been a while. Tensions grew and grew over time, and the U.S. didn't escalate it too much at first in the early part of the 60s. It was just one of those, maybe it'll go away things at the start, and then eventually, it didn't go away, by the way. It escalated over time. President change in the U.S. would do that to you. But the plans changed a little bit after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. That was when a Navy ship got attacked on the coasts by North Vietnam. And so, we just had to respond by escalating the force. And that force really started after 1964 because the draft. The draft started around that time of the decade. And this was the last time there was a draft in the U.S., by the way, for any war. Which is good when you think about it, because we should only send the military to places and not have to draft civilians or try to avoid it entirely. Initially, when it had been escalated, it went well for America and South Vietnam at first, where they weren't fully out of it, but also because most of it was air support and attacking places, like bombing a bunch of different locations. This isn't just limited to North Vietnam, by the way. The other countries around it, mainly for this part, just Laos, got into the war. They got bombed, even if they weren't officially in the war, because part of their government had been friends with North Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh government. So, that would be a threat to the pro-America side, of the Laos government, the correct side as we would. So, Laos got a lot of the bombing, not going to sugarcoat it. It is a lot of the bombing. It's not a little, it's a lot, and so that was the whole idea behind the Vietnam War for a while. We're better in air than they are in the air, so let's just use that to our advantage. And so, eventually, we just did that while having ground combat, because if you didn't know, the jungles in Vietnam are very thick and hard to traverse for people who aren't used to them, and America barely has any jungles, if any, at all. And they weren't able to do that. They weren't used to it. This caused us to rely on Vietnam soldiers and maybe some Agent Orange, just a little bit, to kill parts of the environment and the soldiers there, but American soldiers had to adapt to it. But the last big thing that happened in Vietnam this decade was the Tet Offensive. The big offense against the U.S. and South Vietnam that really did weaken both of them. It was like a big thing. A lot of people were killed in it, but it came from North Vietnam, and overall, it looked like they had won that battle against us. In 1969, Nixon started pulling troops out of Vietnam and started replacing them with other country soldiers, primarily South Vietnam, so that they could just be an independent force that didn't have to rely on us at all. Now, moving out of Vietnam and going somewhere else, we have Cuba, which, if you didn't know, for the U.S., it's just right there. Right next door to us. They're communist now, and they have communist things there. We can't have that, but also that means that they're more aligned with the USSR compared to us. They're not really aligned with us, which isn't good because of what the USSR stands for and how they go against what we are as a country, basically, what the USA stands for, but also because there is a larger threat happening in Cuba. Let's just say in the early 1960s, communism was on the move. It was making moves around here because Cuba got some missiles. It has some missiles from the USSR, which isn't good because it's right there, yet again. That caused the Cuban Missile Crisis because we also had some missiles in Turkey, and it's because we don't want missiles near us, and they don't want missiles near them. I think that's pretty much common sense if you were in a Cold War. But it lasted for 13 days as JFK, who was the president at the time, really had to handle it well. I would say he did personally. That's what like a lot of historians say. A lot of historians are like, whoa, this was really good. It was handled well. Whoa. It's like the one big part of the presidency, according to a lot of historians. Because we didn't blow up. We didn't blow up, which is good. And that was a possibility just due to the hostile nature of the places like the USSR and the other communist places. It gave the stigma to all these communist places that they are violent, and it made the American people think like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be aligned with that, or we should go against that. The last part about the Cold War is this little known thing called the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall, which was a wall that separates East and West Berlin from having influence on each other in either side, and to stop immigration from one side to the other. That immigration really did come from the fact that they saw that system of governing and having lots of money and stuff and wanted that lifestyle. This rich, common sense capitalist West that had these people owning more stuff on average compared to the East and were thriving. The East had a communist government where the government owned everything and didn't give too much of that to the people. There was more oppression on that side. And so these people, they kind of hated that. If there's one thing people hate, it's having their freedom limited in any way, shape, or form. And that freedom isn't limited on the West. Or it is, but not to the same extent on the East. So a lot of people went over there to get that better lifestyle and that better life and that better experience and what people should actually be experiencing, and that being freedom. People need what they need to thrive, and that's what West Berlin was actually able to give compared to the East. That was until this funny thing called the Wall was built and stopped that. They were able to see the prosperous West Side, but it was often dangerous to get over it there. Of course, this did happen in 1961, the same year as the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is kind of what made communism feel stronger but in a bad way when you look at it. It was more in a authoritarian way, where it was kind of by force that these people had to stay in a place that they didn't really want to stay in overall, and they kind of wanted to leave, but they were forced to stay in the East because of the wall and how basically it was kind of close to impossible to get over it with how much military and stuff they had on either side to protect themselves and keep the people in. Now, when we look at how Americans were at the start of the 1960s versus the end of the 1960s, we can see that there was a drastic shift in change from that optimism and that hope for the future to something less optimistic and kind of on the more pessimistic side, but not fully. That was because of a wide factor of things. The first is the assassination of JFK in 1963, which gave that sadness that the president can get assassinated even if he is very well liked, like in the case of JFK. He also, at the time, gave Americans a hope for the future because people who are young and charismatic usually, guys, they usually do that because they're young and charismatic. And that hope was what drove people more and more towards getting stuff done in terms of the space race and having a winning mentality. A winning mentality for the Cold War. But after losing their president, it is kind of hard to have that mentality, especially since it was the youngest president to be elected. You need a winning mentality and having hope for the future because usually if you don't, you won't have a drive to work towards anything without feeling like it's forced. It's easy to have burnout or just no motivation when you have that mentality. But luckily, stuff did get done during LBJ's presidency that related to civil rights because, if you didn't know, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed in 1964. Who would have thought? Which gave some groups of people rights and the rights they were missing, and therefore hope for their future. But due to racism, it was also making some people fearful just because of that racism. That did make a lot of progress domestically in terms of giving people equality and giving people equal opportunities just because of how it opened those floodgates to more people being able to get jobs and do more with their careers because, racism in the career field, it's not that great when you think about it. It was good that it went away and was eliminated, like close to fully because of these acts. But those accomplishments were kind of overshadowed by the Vietnam War, and that was bogging everyone's mood down because you can't really be happy when people are dying in another country and you're not even winning. You don't have that World War II mentality where at least you're winning. With World War II, people were dying, undeniably, but we were winning. We were winning at least. We had something to be happy about. You have a draft that's going on, and you have these things sometimes considered wins, sometimes, but it's hard to tell because it doesn't look like a lot of progress is being made. You could just tell when progress is being made in anything. It's like a built-in thing in your mind. You can just tell. But in this sense, the Vietnam War had not really shown that much progress, and it just felt like men were going there just to die, since it was unknown territory, unknown biomes, and there was a likely chance that they would be dying. And that's kind of what happened. A few people came back depending on where you were stationed, but it just looked like a lot of people died on the battlefield or even were hit by some things that would last a while after the war, like Agent Orange. So even if they were alive, they still had some effects. So this would start out as happiness and being like, yeah, let's defeat communism over there, while people are like pumping their fists. But then the horrors of what happened were starting to leak, and also people were like, guys, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. That became what I like to call the loud minority, but that's like literally the official name, where the people who can voice their opinions and do all that stuff are the louder of the bunch. They're more vocal and outgoing and can say stuff in a way that makes them look right. The people who are loudest in history, they often win. It's all for show, though, because no matter how loud you are you have to have the numbers to back it up. Having a loud voice and saying your opinions does not, it just makes people hear your opinions, but it doesn't really convince them to move to your side as compared to staying on their side. It just makes you look like the majority. We do often listen to the louder voice, but that's just because it's the only voice we hear. Sometimes it's different from what you actually hear, because an opinion can be different like that. Sometimes an opinion doesn't have to be based in fact at all. It can just be a pure opinion. So why does the loud minority matter in this case? It's because of how the decade ended and how the presidencies work. The election of 1968 would decide how America handles the Vietnam War going into the 1970s and however long it takes up. So this was an important election, and since LBJ wasn't running for re-election, it was Richard Nixon versus the vice president, Hubert Humphrey, which is the weirdest name ever for a candidate, modern candidate. So to win, you would think you need to appeal to either the people who oppose the war and not want to keep us in it, or appeal to the other people who do. The other people are a wide array of people because you don't hear from them. That's why you call them the silent majority. This is what had Nixon win in 1968, because the silent majority of people were still for the war in one way or another and didn't really agree with the protests and stuff happening around the U.S. that represented the loud minority. If you have to claim that you are the majority over and over again, then you are probably not the majority, or at least not the silent ones. If you're claiming you're the silent majority, you're not silent anymore. You're not. You're just the loud majority, even if you are the majority. This caused the Vietnam War effort to probably increase going forward in the name of freedom and democracy, because that's what we do. That's our liberating sense in the U.S. So in that sense, the war had just picked up, and the war efforts would continue to go strong into the new decade, which isn't the great for American morale in the long term, but that's just what happens in history. The best thing doesn't always happen. History just tends to happen. Overall, the 1960s were defined by having many things happen in terms of the Cold War and some things starting, but it also gave Americans less hope due to an unfortunate series of events, but also a good series of events somewhat. But they kind of had a weird balance to it. New conversations happened and more rights were allowed for some people, but it gave the country the stark reality when things like JFK being assassinated happened and Vietnam bogging people down. It kind of made people go like, oh man, but at least the space race happened and we won it. It was the time where you can say it was like a child who wasn't exposed to the world did get exposed to the real world in a way. It happens basically everywhere, and everyone has it in their life at different points. But really, that's about it. If you want to comment your thoughts down below, you can. That is your First Amendment right, after all. And if you want to, you should like and subscribe. Pretty please.